that Heydrich's goons would simply stride in and drag them back out. Only the comrades remained, and the emergency telephone number he'd been given more than 2 years ago. This belonged to a photographic studio in Neukölln, which he had used for work in his freelance days, and the burly Silesian named Mirosław Szemski, who owned and ran it. Russell had used the number once in September 1939, and had thereafter deemed it prudent to avoid all contact with Szemski and his studio. Until the previous Friday, that is, when he'd called the number from a public telephone on the Ku'damm. Someone had answered, at least in the sense of picking up the phone. A slight intake of breath was all Russell heard at the other end, and he had probably imagined the whiff of malevolence seeping down the wire. He had put the phone back after a few seconds and concluded that a personal visit to the studio would be unwise. But 3 more days of ominous news from Washington — Japan and the US really did seem to be sliding into war — had reignited his sense of urgency and put him on this train to Neukölln. He knew he was being reckless. If Szemski wasn't there, then at best he had disappeared. At worst, he was under arrest, and Russell would gain nothing from finding out which it was. Yet here he was, needing to know, like a moth to a very real flame. He told himself that Szemski would probably be there, that his own telephone call could have been picked up by a child or an idiot, while the fat Silesian was busy taking pictures, that he was, in any case, an innocent customer with a film in his pocket to prove it, a highly appropriate set of shots of his son Paul at a young folk passing out parade. The risk was negligible, he told himself. The potential prize enormous. He emerged from the U-Bahn entrance on the western side of Berlinerstrasse and walked under the S-Bahn bridge in the direction of the studio. The last time he'd visited it, the street had been full of traffic, the air full of savoury smells, the buildings awash with neon and full of things to sell. Now it reminded him of a German colleague's words, that these days the capital had all the colour of a corpse. The lights were out, the odours dubious, the shop windows at least half empty. The sky seemed to be clearing, a state of affairs which Russell and his fellow Berliners had once anticipated with some relief, assuming, fools that they were, that such conditions would make it easier for the RAF to see and hit their industrial and transport targets. But no, the British pilots seemed incapable of hitting anything relevant to the war effort. Their bombing campaign was like an Italian lottery in reverse. Your chances of losing were extremely remote, but no more remote than anybody else's. Some dear old grandmother in her suburban apartment was as likely to catch it as I.G. Farben. In fact, probably more so, because the pilots were presumably targeting the chemical giant. Russell stopped outside the restaurant, which sat across the road from Szemski's. The photographer's name was still above the door, but the drawn blackout curtains precluded any view of the interior. Was there anyone in? There was only one way to find out. Crossing the empty road, Russell pushed open the door with what he hoped was the brashness of innocence. There was nobody behind Szemski's counter, on which lay a tripod, still attached to a clearly broken camera. A middle-aged man in a dark grey suit was sitting on one of the chairs which the photographer had used for family portraits. His leather coat draped across another, his hands cradled in his lap. His younger partner was sitting almost behind the door, arms folded across the front of his coat. A gun lay on the cabinet beside him. "How can I help you?" the older man asked with a heavy Bavarian accent. He was about 40, with sharpish features that ill-suited his general bulk, rather in the manner of an overinflated Goebbels. "Is the studio closed?" Russell asked. "Where is Herr Szemski?" he added, realizing a few seconds later that acknowledging an acquaintance with the studio's owner might prove unwise. "He's no longer here," said the younger man. He was a Berliner, dark and thin, with the sort of face that would always need shaving. "He's gone out of business," the first man said. "Please sit down," he told Russell, indicating a chair and taking a notebook and pencil from the inside pocket of his jacket. "We have some questions." "What about?" Russell asked, staying on his feet. "And who are you?" he added, hoping to play the outraged innocent. "Gestapo," the older man said shortly, as if it hardly needed saying.